And here is our grand architecture. It's the Palazzo Monroe in Rio de Janeiro, built for the St. Louis World Fair in 1904, disassembled and moved by boat to Rio in 1906, and sadly demolished in 1976 for a more modern building. But when it comes to drawing grand architecture, it's important to understand all the principles are the same as in drawing any architecture. There are basic shapes that make up the structure. But with grand architecture, there's often a lot of decorative elements stuck on over the top, a lot of ornamentation. My approach is to understand the building in terms of its basic shape and then to consider exactly what the ornamentation is. So here we have a box that has these three sections that come out from the box. And this section down here actually is set back from all of this section. And that's important to notice because then we see that this line doesn't line up with these lines and this line doesn't line up with those lines. So those are the sorts of details it's great to see before we start to draw. If we look here, we can also see that here we have a cut-off circular veranda stuck onto the end. Again, though, it's helpful to notice when we're looking at the basic shapes that this isn't a half circle. A half circle, in fact, would be from this column to this column. This is more a 3/4 circle, which affects the way we draw this section here, the curve that we get. And we can see that this dome is in fact a dome, but this dome actually has 8 sides. And that even in this top part, the actual dome, the actual semicircle, sits on top of a relatively straight-sided section. So to me, it comes down to 3 important factors. The first is the perspective angles. Whatever else I might get wrong in the drawing, if I get the perspective angles correct, it will go a long way to making the drawing look okay. So these angles. I need to get the foreshortening correct. As the building moves further away from us and as visual compression happens. And I need to get the proportions correct. So I want to have the height of these columns the right proportion for the total height of the building. And one important comment before I start to draw is that we have to make sure that all the decoration lines up just as precisely on the perspective angles as all the other perspective lines. So for instance, it's not just these lines that need to line up, but this line here, where the bottom part of the drum of each column has a decorative element, that needs to line up. This band on these columns midway down needs to line up. This drawing takes me an hour and a half in real time to draw. So it obviously has been sped up. A lot of it has been sped up to 8 times drawing speed. And the other thing I was conscious of when I started to draw was to draw with a slightly more definite, thicker line here, and then to let the lightness of the line increase as I move further away and further up. And not just the lightness of the line, but also the amount of detail I drew, because that's one of my techniques for creating the sense of something moving further away. And so my plan was to draw this closer section with the most definite line work. And if you'd like to have a go drawing this yourself, again, I'll post this reference photo on my channel community page and you can print it from there. As always, I start with an architectural element of the building that I think I can draw fairly accurately, most easily. So it is this column that's on the corner closest to us. And I'm now going to draw this little corner cluster first, and then hopefully use that to get a sense of proportion to then move away from this relatively central location. So I do these columns and work at getting the details. I have to think about the perspective angles a bit, and even though I'm only doing a fairly narrow horizontal section here of perspective angle, I try and measure and get a sense of the line much further along. I find it's easier to get the lines accurate if I'm trying to plan them over a greater rather than a shorter distance. And so I just use little dots and dashes for that. It's very handy when you draw directly freehand with pen, as I am now with no pencil underline, to learn to put little marks on the paper that you really don't notice at the end. So I actually brought this out a bit far. It should have been a bit closer to the building. And I don't know if you noticed, but I increased that top curvature after I initially drew it. So these are the sort of adjustments we can make even when we're drawing. When I do those little horizontal bands halfway down all the columns, I have to make sure I do them relative to each other in the same positions, and also keep them in the perspective angles along the front of the facade. And so now I'm just doing what I can do down below. In real time, I'm 15 minutes into my drawing at this stage. So I continue to do this rounded veranda area and the detail that would be in shadow if I was going to put shadow on this drawing, which I'm not going to do. I'm not even going to do hatching because I think I'll use this as a means of doing a marker tone lesson shortly. So now I'm positioning these columns that we see through this rounded veranda area. I'm just trying to position where these horizontal bands are. It's worth spending a little bit of time just spacing them as accurately as we can, particularly since they go past this one spot further down the side of the building. So it's not a great photo. There are quite a few parts that are rather indistinct. So sometimes I just have to go with the effect, not with an exactness. So here you can see me getting these perspective angles going some way down the building, and these lines won't necessarily line up exactly with where the horizontal lines are, but they give me guidelines of the perspective angles and the way it changes as it moves up the building to just help me position every line a bit better. I'm just checking my estimation of the width there, and now doing this left hand side of the main entrance on this side of the building. A little bit of fiddling round with the angles, and you can see how I've decided to represent the decorative elements, at least in part, on the building, on the columns in particular, both for the capitals, the Corinthian capitals, and also the decoration on the drum lower down. So particularly when detail is too great to even make out exactly what it is, it's helpful to work out some design that we can apply consistently to the building. There are a number of lamps, street lamps, in front of the building that are quite ornate and decorative, and they were quite fiddly, and it's difficult to really see what they're doing or how they're doing it. And the detail is very indistinct in this old photo, but it's still important to at least reserve the paper for them before I start to draw the columns and the other architectural details behind them. I'm doing that, and it's the reason why I don't do these columns more strongly at this point, is because I'm aware that this large ornate lamppost needs to sit in front. And I also need to start thinking about positioning some of these trees that are along the front of the building while I'm doing the lower sections. So it's why I don't usually start with the lower sections of a building, because there's too many foreground items that just make it difficult to concentrate on proportions. Whereas I find if I get the proportions understood in my head without the overlapping items in front, it's easier then to do those and keep them accurate. Looks like I bumped my camera a little moment back there. So again, starting to get these perspective angles. You can see before I getting too much detail with the windows and things, I make sure I get the angles correct with some light lines that will be hidden in the detail that I then go to do. There were some lines and things in front of this entranceway, and it was again a bit blurry, a bit indistinct to know exactly what was happening. So I took a bit of license with these front steps and the sides to it, and there were two enormous lamps also flanking the entrance, which the bases of which were hard to make out because they were dark against dark, but I did my best. I've got this final section of the building to work on. It sets back a bit further, as I said, so all the horizontal lines drop slightly from the ones I've already drawn, and I do want to keep my drawing of this further section very light, less detail, slightly looser, more gestural lines, so that it just sits back behind the line of the building I've already drawn. I start to put in some of these street trees, relatively low pruned trees, because they obviously impact what we see of the building itself at street level. I had a bit of trouble trying to work out these sections because it was pretty indistinct on the photograph. Just some fairly loose light lines to very gesturally suggest the windows that are there. And then the final colonnaded section coming out on the corner. But the most important thing, as I said, is to keep all these architectural elements lined up in the correct perspective pattern. So now I have all the rooftop designs and elements to do. And again, it was very hard to make out the details, so I'm being pretty gestural and a little bit simplified with how I do them. I'm really, as I always do, creating the effect of the architecture, not the exactness of it. There's a balustrade that runs around the top, so I thought I might put that in because that affects the way we see proportions of the other details we have to draw. So work on this first fairly low flattened dome. Domes are always pretty stressful to draw, aren't they? Especially when you're directly in pen. And I often struggle a bit with the right-hand side of the dome because I'm right-handed. So now I'm needing to position this main central dome. But I get distracted with putting in a few more details at street level, so I go down and do those. They're not as much fun to draw, I don't think, as drawing the actual architecture. And then it's back to the dome. So there are these buttresses that come out at an angle to each of the corners, which slope outwards from top to bottom. So a little bit of fiddling around to get something that looks like them, and then I can start to go upwards. I feel like I probably took this drum section up just a little bit too high at this stage, but I'm not going to worry about that. It was hard to work out exactly the detail that was in the photo here. I eventually worked out there were sculpted figures here holding trumpets. So I did my best with these figures, and then there was this round window in between. Possibly if this round window had just been a little bit lower, that would have kept the proportions of the dome perhaps a little more accurate. And then again, I'm trying to work out the dome, particularly the tricky, for me, right-hand side of the curve, and then put the little pole on top. And now it's getting pretty close to being finished, so I'm looking to see what details haven't I done, checking some of the proportions. Are there any adjustments I need to make where I can just angle something up or down slightly more and have it look more correct? Because often just drawing over a line slightly can really improve the perspective. And with my style anyway, where there's plenty of lines for every line, it's not so obvious that we've done that. And then just finishing the last of these details in front, and a little bit of a street level gutter indication, and I'm pretty much finished it. As I said, it took me an hour and a half, 90 minutes to do in real time, and that's about what I thought it would take. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Hey, if you've made it to this point, why not subscribe if you haven't already? I have hundreds of videos that explain my thoughts about the creative process, as well as more precise explaining of how I think and the techniques I use when I draw, and lots of actual demonstration drawings to go with that. So why not hit subscribe and also notifications so you know when there's a new video to see. So how do you think this went? Overall, I was pleased with it. In terms of proportions, this rounded section comes out just a little bit too far from the building if we compare it to the reference. And I feel that this dome just sits a little bit high around here. But otherwise, I'm happy with how it worked out, and I'm happy with the effect of shifting my line work down here so that it becomes a bit lighter and a bit looser than here at the start. The challenge with a building such as this is that there are so many lines that if we're not careful, the actual line work itself can overwhelm what the line work is wanting to show. So why not print my reference off the community page and have a go yourself? But whatever you draw and however you're drawing it, have fun. I'll see you next time. Remember, hit notifications and you'll know when next time is. Bye.